Hi there. Here we are, week 10. I'm, of course, recording this before week 10 has started, but nonetheless, week 10. And, it's proving to be a time of integration of the ideas that Gil and Caitlin and I have been working on with you. Is now to start bringing things together. And one of the ways to do that is to look at the role or place of globalization, particularly with urbanization, in shaping our current reality. One of the things I'm hoping that you're getting a sense of is that realities are very contextual, that the reality of somebody living here on the Sunshine Coast is very, very different to somebody living in Karachi or New Delhi or Mexico City or somewhere like that. It's also very different from the realities of people who are still working the land. And of course, if we start going back in the past or if we project ourselves into the future, we can understand that realities and those contexts are constantly changing, constantly mobile. And that's one of the things about globalization, is that it is not a static process. You could say that we've been globalizing since human beings or even hominids left the sub-Saharan world of Africa, a very different reality. So what I want to do today is to walk you through aspects of the reading from this wonderful book, Terra Incognita, trying to get it so that you can see it, given that, of course, I'm a little thumbnail up in the corner. A great book, very, I think, sensitive and thoughtful scholars. But let's leap into it, because one of the things about globalization is that it tends to elicit fear and hope. There are people who put, a lot of anxiety into this sense that the world is integrating local identities, especially local identities of people who are not yet in the modern world, as we would call it. Those identities can lead to extreme and violent reactions, fundamentalisms of different kinds, and so on. But also there are people who, and I'm thinking of a book that I had 10 or 15 years ago, must be on the shelf somewhere, The World is Flat. Friedman, the author's name was, or is, should I say. He just thought everything, all our economic, social problems, issues of equity, access, and so on, were going to be solved by globalization. So he's a profound globalist, you might say. So what can we say? Well, I'm always, it's very hard to capture something that you want to say from a big fat book like this. So we've got the reading, which is essentially chapter 1 on globalization, but I actually went to the introduction to grab these comments for you. To flourish in our wounded and interconnected planet, we must get better at interpreting data. That's why this beautiful image is here. Yeah, what do we make of data, big data and so on? They say we've got to learn to separate signal from noise. And of course, they're trying to do this through maps, through mapping the complexities of our world. And in the subtitle of the book, if you hadn't noticed, is 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years. It's very well executed book, beautiful maps, of course, for many things. But, it's all about, these are guys who use data to tell stories. And I think that's really important to understand that. And they're hopeful people. They say even as governments and businesses and so on struggle with COVID-19, we collectively have the potential, based on our choices and so on, to make this the best century in human history. Now, that's a very unusual message when we're facing, people who are talking about the end of the world through, Anthropocene, or the world, should I say, as we know it. As we are invested in it. In other words, we're all working away, you're all studying so that you can get jobs in the future. But what's that future going to be? What's it going to entail? Should you actually be studying, permaculture for, an arid continent or something like that? Or perhaps we should be looking more closely at indigenous ways of understanding and knowing the world and reading the world and responding to the world. Are we all studying and am I teaching the wrong stuff? Well, that's very much for you to decide. So let's keep on moving. Last week, we looked at urbanization, week 9. And so I wanted to give a sort of selection, very much just whack down cities from my own data set up here. But Uruk, one of the very earliest Mesopotamian cities, Babylon, which was a great Assyrian city with its supposed hanging gardens, Luoyang, which I'm not sure why it's a bigger font, but anyway, that's the picture here. It was the capital city of 12, 13, 14 Chinese dynasties. It's a wonderful place in China. And of course, you couldn't put down Rome. Tikal, you've probably heard of, one of the great Mayan cities. London started off as a muddy little outpost for the Romans, Londonium, and it became, the great city it is today, but it went through many twists and turns. It was a horrid place to live for many, many centuries. Baghdad, by contrast to London, one of the most shining examples of Islamic cities. It was, almost a utopia compared to London. I was trying to find the word. Then we've got Timbuktu, which is, the city that, this week's reading from the National Geo history is all about. I put Paris down because Paris is really interesting. We've got the French Revolution and, kings and queens having their heads cut off and all that stuff. But no, I was thinking more about the Paris of the late 19th century into the 20th century of Paris. That was very much like New York, I guess, is today. It's a magnet for creatives. All the great painters and many of the great musicians of the early 20th century, late 19th century come from there, or were based there, not come from there. They all went there from different places. I'm thinking about Paris after 1917, as the First World War came to an end, you had the Bolshevik Revolution. You had Russian emigres coming there that, brought new ideas and so on to that visual arts world, particularly. New York today is not only an economic center, it's also a cultural center and so on. Karachi, listed, sadly for those people living there, it's about the 11th, 12th biggest city on the planet, but it's also listed as one of the 10 worst cities on the planet to live in. I put Karachi down because I think about it because in my academic work, I'm editing books and publishing and so on, and I've had to deal quite a number of times with people working from Karachi in the editing process. But these cities have been hit, and those particular businesses have been hit pretty hard with COVID. And they've certainly, my current experience has been, trying to get a book published, and it's been going through almost a glacial process because the cities in Southeast Asia and the businesses such as these businesses that have been offshored by companies in the US or wherever. I'm not going to mention their names. It's almost popping out of my mouth, but I won't. They, we've had to push and cajole, be patient, breathe in, breathe out, and so on. That's me and my colleagues in getting these books published. This current book is actually going to be a fantastic book on identities. I think it's moved forward into the very last stages of publishing. We will have to wait and see. But, so we've got a wide range of cities here, all of which, represent people's aspirations, migration to and from cities. It happens a lot. Rome was all roads lead to Rome, which was in fact a reality for people living within the Roman Empire. Roman Empire was a globalizing empire. It was a microcosm of globalization. Obviously, it wasn't planetary, but the world to the Romans was what was within their borders. So let's move on. I just wanted to give you a shopping list of some cities. If you don't know some of those cities, go and look them up. It's always good to be curious about these things. Oh, I've never heard of Tikal, you might be saying. But it's a very, very significant city in the history of the Mayan peoples, for instance. So what can we say about globalization? Drawing on this book here, globalization is the integration of world systems, biosphere, that means, the natural world, ethnosphere, the cultural world, technosphere, the technological world, and they talk quite a bit in the reading, if you've done it, about the internet, band speeds, and so on, and the economic sphere, of course. So 2 little quotes, one from before your reading starts and one from the reading. Let's start with the one from the reading. Globalization translates into the sum of human activities. I like that, the sum of our activities crossing national borders, okay? So that's a very anthropocentric way of looking at it. For me, you can't talk about globalization without also talking about the natural world. But that's in my mind and not necessarily in the author's minds, and also the data they're looking at, the very human data. So globalization, from the introduction to this book, they say that it's the accelerated movement of people's products and ideas around the planet, of course. And products, I think you can have manufactured products, but also natural aspects. Climate change is a very good example of that. Globalization as a force for good. This is from the reading. The impacts of current wave of globalization, they say, are increasingly uneven. So one of the issues they're really concerned about is equity here, access to the benefits of globalization. But they take a rather positive take on this. To be sure, no force in history has generated more benefits more quickly. Just think of a few centuries for more people. The tide of change initiated after the Second World War brought with it unprecedented human progress in nutrition, literacy, longevity, and other key indicators. Okay, so these are really important. It's important to understand that for all that globalization might be the source of many woes or problems or headaches that we have today, that it has actually, changed the fortunes of most of us in Australia, but well beyond that, people across Southeast Asia, 2 billion or more people have been lifted out of abject poverty. And that, that's a huge number to actually look at. So what are the questions then we have about globalization? Well, of course, I mentioned inequity or inequality, that there are the haves and the have-nots. Technology, access to or not, like broadband. There are examples of Africa, where I think only 4 of the African countries have broadband that even comes somewhere near being adequate. I think they had 5 megabytes there per second or whatever it is, whereas they think to really be effectively engaged in the world economic and communication systems, you need a minimum of 10 megabytes per second. Of course, we can see problems around disease transmission, COVID-19 being the latest one, and something that we've called cultural globalization as opposed to economic, which is where I'm actually dealing with this with a new book that I've been working on. I want to get it published with multiple languages in it, but will the publishers, well, so far I've had no. As the answer, they only privilege English, for instance. And I think that's very interesting. But it's also worrying because there are aspects of that are intimately part of the human psyche and the way we think that, get played out in one's mother tongue. So cultural hegemony, the dominance of the Anglo-Saxon world around the planet, it may be resisted, but it's there eating away all the time at sort of the cultural infrastructure and particularly language. So these are areas that worry these guys, Golden and Muga, and they should be worrying us too. We should be very sensitive to them so that we can work our way towards remedying those issues through our own choices and our own actions. So let's talk about migration. There's another chapter in this book on migration. And I want to sort of bring in some aspects of that chapter, but I want to sort of look at it more carefully or in more specifically here. So migration, of course, is the movement of peoples and their tribes. But this inspires, particularly in times of cultural stress, and inspired lots of fear and loathing. You know, the barbarian. Now, barbarian is an interesting word because it comes from Greek. The ancient Greeks, the Athenians particularly, used that word for anybody who wasn't Greek, because the language of these people, blah, 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 sounded like that. So the barbarian is a sort of an archetype of people that we should be afraid of. And of course, if you read rather superficial histories of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, we got barbarians knocking down the doors there, the Vandals and the Goths. If you go a bit earlier than that, you've got people like the Sea People, who no one really knows who they were ethnically. There are a number of suggestions. So if you follow that link, you'll find there. But you know, they can't take the credit completely for the collapse of the early classical world around 1200 BCE, but certainly they played a major role in destabilizing economies, trade routes, and so on. And they were essentially Vandals and Goths, 2 millennia before the Vandals and Goths were doing their things. And we just have to think of the word Vandal with its common connotations. You know, the Vandals were a Germanic people who ended up, conquering the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and they had kingdoms there up until the peninsula was taken out by Islam in around the 7th century. So so we have these connotations of stereotypes. So when we get people moving around today, it's very easy for the media to play on that. It's a bit like the word crusade or something like that as well. It's easy for the media to pick up on that and to press buttons where we think, oh, the Roman Empire collapsed because of, German tribes invading, the barbarians smashed through, and so on. These are very unsophisticated, crude ways of thinking about things. So I've got the word Syrian there with the arrow pointing at these two girls. Syrians, half of that country has been displaced because of the horrid civil war that's going on there. It's a really, really unpleasant situation, as you presumably know. These people are being forced out of their countries. Many of them are not going that far, but some have come to Europe or tried to get into Europe, some with tragic consequences, of course. These are people who have, they're not migrating because they want to, they're migrating because you have, as parents, let's say, of these two young kids, you want to see that they have a future that's going to be worth living. Boat people in the Australian context, again, and we can be proud of our detention centres. We at least have learned something from the Nazis, if nothing else. That's me being facetious, of course. But, it's the power of the image of what we call the other is the dark, shadowy side of globalization and migration, as it is discussed. So we need to take a longer view. And I think that's something that these guys in the reading make very clear. When we see from a historical perspective, migration, for instance, the recent levels of migration are not particularly unusual. In fact, bombarded, they're talking about the sensationalist media stuff, bombarded by sensationalist and xenophobic media headlines, many people now see migrants as a problem, as a threat, okay? This is a mistake in many countries, although not everywhere. More migrants are in fact needed. Why? Because we have deficits in nursing or in doctors or engineering or whatever it might be. Migrants are not just, inverted commas, losers, but they are people who bring richness and diversity to other cultures. And of course, they bring economic advantages as well. So let's think about this from a different perspective. Where's my other book? It's around here somewhere. Oh, here it is, The Good Ancestor. I think I've waved this book at you before. So I've got a couple of links here. This is a live link. It's a wonderful little 2 or 3 minute clip on YouTube. Christian Eric is a very interesting thinker. He's actually from Melbourne, but he's based in London now. And he's in his book, he says, look, over a period of 1 million years or so, 2 million years, sorry, our ancestors performed an incredible feat. we grew brains that allowed us to escape from the present and become part-time residents of the future. I think it's interesting he says part-time residents of the future because we're also, in many respects, part-time and or even full-time residents of the past, where we live in the past a lot in order to escape the present. But the future was something that's come out of modernity. You know, people in the Middle Ages didn't think of a future other than that beyond the end of times or the apocalypse is coming. Evolutionary psychologists and archaeologists, he goes on, suggest that the capacity to think and plan for the long term conferred evolutionary advantage. So, and he uses throughout the this book, and that's why you've got little acorn there. Okay, the image of the acorn, the tree that you need to plant the seed, and knowing that you will never get to see the tree in its maturity because the tree doesn't mature for 300, 400, 500 years. Or the marshmallow. Oh, look, there's a marshmallow. Let's grab it and eat it now. Instant gratification. He says that we've got two parts of our brain that, you know, are often fighting with one another. But, you know, in the same chapter that this little quote comes from, he makes the point that, you know, what kind of, you know, innovation it was to have people who always lived on the edge of starvation, on the edge of, you know, highly vulnerable to changes in the world. He says, look, what kind of thinking was involved in keeping that grain there safe for the next season to go and plant it when you were and your kids were all hungry through the depths of winter, for instance? So this is something we need to think about because people don't migrate or move without a reason. The Germanic peoples who came in and entered the Roman Empire were being forced by, you know, movements of people across these Southeast Asian steppes and so on. And the Syrians who are coming into Europe and elsewhere now, Turkey and places like that, are also moving because they have to type thing. The movements of people from Europe to our country, Australia, and to the New World was immense and, you know, hit a peak from the 1840s on. And I'm going to give you a quote about that in a moment, or a statement about that. But following Karajic's work, you know, on page 27, he's got this lovely diagram, you know, of, you know, the elements of long brain, wave finding, grandmother effect, that's intergenerational stuff, social cooperation, and tool innovation. It's really important to understand that when changes in human sociality, human culture, human civilizational processes emerge, that they don't emerge just because of one dimension. They emerge as a result of multiple interrelated things or forces. That's the word, not things. That's not a very academic term, is it? How humans grew their long brains. So human survival depended on an ability to plan hunting and foraging trips and so on. The grandmothers looking after children created intergenerational time horizons. That's the long time view. Social cooperation, of course, is important because it creates bonds that persist through time, over time. And, you know, we can't underestimate the role of technology at any time in the globalizing or human socializing processes. So this all comes from, is written up very nicely and very accessibly on the Longnail Foundation. You don't have to go up and buy the book, though it's a great read, very accessible. So it's about, we need to reframe things. Going back to the reading, this is from the migration chapter, which you don't, I think, have at your fingertips. But, you know, compared to the past, they point out, the world is not experiencing exceptionally high levels of migration. All right, it's really, we need to understand that, despite the media coverage. At least as a share of our population, the age of mass migration from 1840 through to 1910 or so lasted 70 years, involved much higher levels of rates of both emigration and immigration. They talk about the movements of people to and from across the planet. Lots of people from different cultures actually return to their country of origin after a period of being overseas. We can see that today. But we need to reframe this question of globalization. We need to see it as movement, but not necessarily movement of just peoples. Cities play a part. The urbanization process is part of this globalizing process. But, we have to understand that there's more to it than that. Here we go. The great Vikings have to always slip in, people are the great pecs. Okay, so these Vikings, what can we say about that? Well, there's a guy called David Northrop, and I put his article up on this week's modules, okay, under either, I think it's, getting ready for the before class type thing. I put his article there because we used to use it quite extensively in this course, but I really like his argument that, look, that we went from a period of millennia of divergence where we left Africa and the human species constantly seemed to be on the move. We ended up colonizing every part of the world, of the planet, that was colonizable. No one wanted to go and live in Antarctica, of course. The Vikings had a crack at colonizing Greenland and Iceland. Eventually they succeeded, but there were major failures first. The reason why I've chosen the Vikings as the photograph is because Northrop makes a lot about the fact that the Vikings completed the circle of the colonizing or movement of peoples around the planet. We have people from Asia, Southeast Asia, coming across the Bering Strait into North America, eventually, populating both continents, North and South and Central. But what did the Vikings do? Well, you probably can answer this question. They went from further west as opposed to the eastern route, and they actually discovered, in inverted commas, or arrived in Newfoundland in North America around the year 1000. So Northrop's arguing here in this little quote, irregularly at first, and then with increasing force and speed after the year 1000 CE, historical forces drew people closer and closer economically, culturally, and politically. In other words, he's making an argument for convergence of peoples, which we would now call globalization. So it's worth thinking about that. And again, I'm giving you this because click back to a slide. It's about reframing and thinking about the processes of globalization differently. So where can we go? Well, I want to talk about briefly the conversation that I had with Sophia Basile, who is currently a resident of New York, where she grew up. Now, Sophia is one of the most, well-traveled people that I know, really, and, we experience all over the place, as you can tell even from the brief little conversation that I have with her. But she said, well, I'd asked her, well, tell me about globalization. What are some of the skills? And she said the essential skills she feels for being a global citizen, that means a person who understands that they're part of global forces, is a profound, and this I'm quoting her now, profound commitment to constant unlearning. Okay, she also names curiosity. So she points to these two things. You've got to be curious and you've got to be unlearning. What does unlearning mean? Well, I've got Manish Jain here, who's a really fascinating guy, an Indian, as you can tell, who in 2010 founded a university called Swaraj University. And, Swaraj University is about unlearning. He's talking, if you click on that or you look below this slide, you'll find him on YouTube, giving a précis or a summary of his ideas. And, for me, it's really, really important that we rethink how we do our education, because our education system itself, in my humble opinion, destroys curiosity. It makes you, the student, and me, the teacher, perform for answers. It's because, of course, answers are accessible. We can assess, oh, yes, you know the dates for the kings and queens of England, or, the key dates for the discoveries of all the rivers in Australia or something. But that's not knowledge. That's just information. Or, as the guys in our key reading would call it, it's just data. It's what we do with data that is important. So we need to be unlearning. And I want you to think about that and to think about, what are you curious about? I've brought this up multiple times because, to me, as an historian and as a global citizen. It's curiosity that keeps us moving. It keeps us passionate about the world we're in and the world that's becoming and emerging. I'm really curious about what's going to happen in the next decade or 2 decades and so on. So what can we say? In conclusion, we've got curiosity equals skepticism. Going back to our key reading, again, this is from the introduction just before the chapter on globalization. You know, I think it's in their last paragraph almost, we say we must always be skeptical, interrogating what is included in the maps, that's the context, and constantly questioning what is missing and why. The absences are really, really important. Why does this map look like this? Why does this map privilege this view over that view? What's missing? It's who's not at the table type question. It's often the who's not at the table is a question for globalization. We're talking about globalization. We get excited about technology, economic flows, prosperity, and so on. But who's not there? Not only is nature not at the table, that's why we've got climate change, you know, breathing down our necks, but also many peoples on the planet are excluded really from the conversation of globalization. It's dangled in front of them as a carrot that might draw them into the globalizing system. We need to be curious and skeptical at the same time. So that's the end of this lecture or lecturette, snapshot, whatever we're calling it. So there we go. I'm going to say goodbye to you. I look forward to seeing my guys in class next week, really enjoying the Pechacuchas. And, you know, I'm hoping that many of you are enjoying the experience of being able to create your own. See you then, and thanks so much. Bye.